The rain tapped gently against the bay window of the small brick house in York as Eleanor Hastings sat motionless in her favorite armchair. The fire in the hearth had long faded to a soft amber glow, but she stayed where she was, her hands resting quietly on the faded tartan blanket that covered her knees. Retirement had arrived, not with a celebration, but with silence. After 38 years as a city librarian, she had packed her things in 3 cardboard boxes and walked away from the only world where her voice had mattered. The house belonged to her son now. Thomas had insisted she move in with him and his wife, Claire, after her lease in the old cottage expired. It was meant to be temporary, but months had passed. Eleanor's name was never added to the postbox, and her room, which had once been a cozy guest bedroom, now felt more like a storage loft. Cold. Bare. Forgotten. Claire rarely spoke to her unless it was necessary. She was efficient, polished, and always in motion. A marketing executive who lived by digital calendars and color-coded labels. Eleanor, with her soft cardigans, ink-stained fingers, and a preference for handwritten letters, seemed to be a relic in Claire's world of sleek surfaces and noise-cancelling earbuds. That morning, Eleanor had come down to the kitchen early, hoping for a warm cup of tea before anyone else stirred. But Claire was already there, standing barefoot on the tiled floor, typing furiously into her phone with one hand while sipping a green smoothie with the other. The room smelled of kale and cold ambition. "You're up early," Eleanor said gently. Claire didn't look up. "Client call in 10 minutes. Please keep the Wi-Fi free." Eleanor offered a small nod and turned back to the kettle. When she reached for the cupboard, she saw it. Her books. The entire shelf of leather-bound classics she had unpacked with such care when she moved in. Gone. Replaced by Claire's tech manuals, brand strategy guides, and something titled The Algorithm of Influence. "Where are the books?" Eleanor asked, almost too quietly to be heard. Claire blinked. "Oh, those. We needed the space. Thomas said you wouldn't mind. They're boxed up in the garage." She didn't wait for a reply. Eleanor stood still for a moment. Then she poured the boiling water into her mug, stirring the tea slowly. She didn't drink it. She simply held the warmth between her palms and stared out the kitchen window as the clouds pressed low over the rooftops. By the time Thomas came downstairs, Claire was already locked away in her home office, and Eleanor had retreated back to the attic. He found her folding clothes into a neat stack on the bed. "Mum, what's this? Going somewhere?" She smiled. Softly. "Just making space." Thomas scratched the back of his neck. "Claire's under a lot of pressure lately. You know how it is." Eleanor nodded. But she didn't know. Not really. What she knew was that pressure reveals the strength of things. Like bridges. Or people. Or families. That night, as the wind howled faintly through the eaves, Eleanor lit a candle beside her bed. On her lap was a notebook. Not a new one. Worn at the edges. Inside were scribbled verses, quotes, and letters never sent. She picked up a fountain pen and wrote just one line beneath the date. "A library silenced becomes a memory buried alive." She capped the pen, closed the book, and placed it carefully into her suitcase. The garage smelled of damp concrete and motor oil. Eleanor stood by the far wall, where a pile of cardboard boxes leaned precariously next to an old bicycle. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering light across the cold floor. Her breath came out in soft white clouds as she opened the first box. Inside, she found a mess of her old scarves, some framed photographs, and a chipped porcelain tea set wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. The books, she quickly realized, had not been stored with care. Spines were bent, pages warped from moisture, and 2 volumes were growing patches of mold. She crouched down, her knees protesting, and began to sort through the contents. Each book she touched was like a whisper from the past. Middlemarch, gifted by her mentor when she first became a librarian. Jane Eyre, annotated in the margins from nights of quiet reflection. Wuthering Heights, its binding held together with ribbon and hope. Claire's voice echoed faintly from upstairs, muffled through floorboards and wireless headsets. Eleanor ignored it. Here in the garage, there was no schedule. No expectations. Only silence. And paper. And memory. She pulled out her suitcase and began placing the driest, most intact volumes inside. She chose with care, weighing memory against necessity. Not all could come with her. That realization hurt more than she thought it would. As she worked, she uncovered an old wooden box with a rusted clasp. She had not seen it in years. It had belonged to her mother, passed to her on her 18th birthday. Inside were yellowing letters, pressed violets, and a small, hand-bound journal filled with stories Eleanor had written as a girl. Forgotten tales of witches in moors, brave queens in tower rooms, and lonely children who always found home in unexpected places. She smiled as her fingers ran across the ink-stained pages. Then came a sound. A soft knock. The garage door opened a few inches, and Thomas peeked in, his face tight with guilt and discomfort. "Mum, it's freezing out here." "What are you doing?" Eleanor looked up at him, her hands still on the wooden box. "Just taking stock," she said evenly. Thomas stepped inside and rubbed his arms. "I told Claire to wait before clearing the shelves. I didn't think she'd move your things so quickly." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She simply gestured to the scattered books, the broken spines, the water-stained memories. "She moved more than shelves, Thomas." He shifted, unable to hold her gaze. "I can fix it," he said eventually. "We'll make space. Put them back." Eleanor stood slowly. "You don't understand. Once a book's spine is broken, it may still stand on a shelf. But it never reads the same again." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but she had already turned away, zipping up her suitcase with calm precision. The door creaked shut behind him a moment later. That night, Eleanor sat at her tiny attic desk with the wooden box beside her. She opened the journal and began to write again, not in the style of her librarian years, but in the voice of the young girl who once believed stories could heal anything. And in the quiet of the attic, stories began to rise once more. Eleanor stood before the empty shop front on Blake Street, a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a paper cup of tea warming her hands. The windows were dusty, and the "To Let" sign hung askew in the glass. Behind it, shadows of forgotten shelves and a cracked wooden counter waited in stillness. This place had once been a sweet shop. Later, a mobile phone repair center. Now it was nothing. But Eleanor saw something else. A haven. A quiet room with wooden floors, soft lamps, and rows upon rows of stories. Her stories. Others' stories. Shelves that would never be cleared without consent. She took a long sip of tea, then walked around the side alley where the landlord had agreed to meet her. Mr. Evans was a wiry man in his 60s, with an old dog named Pip and more interest in crossword puzzles than small talk. But he had taken to Eleanor's quiet manner and her firm handshake. "No damp, but the pipes moan a bit in the winter," he muttered as he unlocked the door. "Electrics are sound. You'll want to paint." Eleanor stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and thyme. She imagined tables by the window, a kettle in the back, books arranged by emotion rather than author. A shelf just for forgotten poetry. Another for childhood favorites. "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Evans blinked. "You don't want a few days to think." "I've done quite enough thinking." That night, she returned to the attic with a key in her coat pocket and a notebook full of lists. What she needed. What she didn't. What she could borrow, barter, or find at the charity shop. Claire noticed the change. She watched Eleanor move through the kitchen with purpose. She asked Thomas if something had happened. He shrugged. She's been writing again, I think. Claire wasn't fond of mysteries she couldn't explain. Especially ones that involved Eleanor smiling to herself over toast. Days turned into a week. Every morning Eleanor rose early, dressed in her blue wool coat, and took the bus into town. She worked with quiet focus, scrubbing walls, removing nails from old shelves, sorting through piles of donated books she had quietly asked for through a handwritten notice she left in the church hall. Some evenings, she would sit on the dusty wooden floor and read aloud to the empty room. She began with Austen. Then moved on to Baldwin. And then, one Wednesday afternoon, a small envelope arrived at the house. Hand-addressed. The ink neat and deliberate. Claire, always the first to sort the post, held it up with raised brows. Who's writing to you in pen these days? Eleanor smiled faintly. Readers. They still exist. She took the letter upstairs, unfolded it carefully, and read the message within. It was from a young woman named Harriet, who had found the notice at the church. Her mother had recently passed, leaving behind hundreds of books and nowhere to take them. She wondered if Eleanor might accept them. Not sell. Just keep them safe. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reread the words. The following morning, she arrived at the shop early, a soft blue sky above her and a lightness in her step. The old lock clicked open like an invitation. Inside, she placed the letter on the windowsill. Then she took the first book from her satchel, a volume of poetry by Carroll and Duffy, and placed it gently on the front shelf. It had begun. The bell above the shop door gave a sharp little chime, breaking the stillness of the late morning. Eleanor looked up from the crate of paperbacks she had been organizing. A man stood in the doorway, hesitant, his hand still on the handle. He was in his late 20s, his coat too thin for the wind outside, and his eyes carried the nervous curiosity of someone not quite sure if they had entered the right place. Come in, Eleanor said gently, brushing her hands on her skirt. You look frozen. The man stepped inside. Sorry. I saw the window. It didn't look like a shop yet, but the sign said, open soon. It is, Eleanor replied. Not entirely ready, but books don't mind a bit of mess. He smiled faintly, stepping further into the room. His eyes wandered across the walls, still half bare, some lined with carefully stacked novels, others waiting to be filled. I'm Adam, he said. My aunt used to own a little bookshop in Norwich. I saw yours, and I suppose I just missed the feeling. Eleanor nodded. There's something about old paper and the smell of ink that calls us back, even if we don't realize it. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment before Adam walked over to the nearest shelf and ran his finger along a row of poetry. You like Carroll and Duffy? She saved me, once, Eleanor said softly. Not with a phone call or a visit. Just words on paper. Sometimes that's enough. Adam nodded, almost reverently. Then he asked, do you need help? I mean, with setting up. Eleanor hesitated. She had grown used to doing everything alone. But something in Adam's tone wasn't pity. It was purpose. Yes, she said at last. Yes, I do. From that afternoon onward, Adam began to appear regularly. He came after shifts at the cafe nearby, bringing leftover pastries and news of street repairs. He swept floors, mended old stools, and catalogued titles in his careful, slanted handwriting. They worked in silence often, the kind that felt rich, not empty. Eleanor found herself talking more than she expected, about her years at the library, about the quiet heartbreaks of motherhood, about how sometimes people moved on without truly leaving. Adam never pressed. He simply listened. One afternoon, while arranging a stack of children's books, he asked, will this place be a shop or a library? Eleanor looked around. Something in between, she said. A sanctuary. For stories and for the people who still need them. He smiled, and for the first time, she noticed how tired his eyes were beneath the kindness. That night, Eleanor stayed behind after he left. She lit a small lamp in the corner and opened her journal. Pages were filling fast now, her handwriting firm, her voice returning in full. She wrote of the young man with the kind voice, of the poetry that had survived the cold, and of the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more waiting at the edges of life than she had dared to believe. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. And inside, stories continued to stir. It was a bitter Thursday morning when Eleanor saw her again. The bell above the door had just rung, and she looked up, expecting Adam or perhaps one of the elderly locals who had begun peering in curiously from time to time. But instead, there stood Claire. Still elegant, still precise. Her red coat was buttoned to the neck, her scarf a perfect match. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes scanned the room with deliberate slowness. Eleanor's heart fluttered, just once, like the thud of a book dropped on a quiet floor, then settled. She stood calmly behind the desk, her fingers resting lightly on an open copy of Middlemarch. Claire stepped inside, her heels tapping softly on the wooden boards. "I heard from Thomas that you'd taken a shop." "I have," Eleanor replied evenly. Claire looked around with a faint smirk. "So this is where you've gone." Eleanor said nothing. The silence stretched until Claire finally spoke again. "It's rather more than I expected. Dusty, but charming." Eleanor walked to a small tray near the back wall and poured herself a cup of tea. "Would you like one?" Claire hesitated. Then nodded. They sat opposite each other at the small table beneath the window, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. "I thought you might have come to see the children," Claire said after a while. "They ask after you, you know. Even if they don't always say so." "I imagine they're fine," Eleanor replied. "Claire, what is it you've come to say?" Claire looked down into her tea, as if searching for something in the steam. "I'm not entirely sure. I suppose I thought, if I saw it, whatever it is you're doing here, it might make more sense." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Does it need to make sense to you?" That stopped Claire. She met Eleanor's gaze, something flickering in her expression, anger. "Regret?" "This shop," Claire said quietly, "what is it really? Some kind of rebellion? A second chance? A museum for a life that slipped away?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "It's a beginning." Claire's voice hardened slightly. "But what about the rest of us? Do you think it's easy, Eleanor? Managing a house with 3 children and a husband who works himself to death just to keep us warm. Do you think I wanted things to fall apart?" Eleanor's fingers gripped the edge of her teacup. "I don't think you wanted that," she said. "I think you forgot how to see me. That's all." There was a long silence. Then Claire stood. "You're still good at making people feel small." Eleanor stood as well. "And you're still good at pretending you're the only one who ever hurts." Claire's lips parted, as if to speak again, but no words came. She turned and walked to the door. Her heels clicked briskly across the floor. Before she opened it, she paused. "You know," she said without turning around, "when I was little, I always thought you were magic. I thought you knew everything." The bell rang as she left. Eleanor stood still for a long while. Then she walked to the window and watched the red coat vanish into the crowd. That evening, Adam found her reshelving a row of biographies. Her hands moved steadily, but her eyes looked far away. "She came," she said quietly. Adam didn't ask who. Instead, he picked up a book and began to help. A week passed with no sign of Claire. The bookshop settled back into its gentle rhythm, like a tide returning after a brief, strange wave. The days grew longer, the windows steamed with the scent of lemon balm and ink, and Eleanor resumed her quiet rituals, unpacking crates, dusting jackets, and writing at the little oak desk beneath the hanging ivy. Then, one morning, Adam arrived with an envelope in his hand. "This was pushed through the door," he said, offering it to her. No stamp. No name. Eleanor took it without a word. The envelope was pale cream, the kind used for weddings or farewells. Her name was written in deep blue ink, not typed, not scribbled. Carefully shaped, like someone still believed handwriting could mean something. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet. At the top, no greeting. Just, "You once told me stories are anchors." I never understood what that meant. I think I do now. Claire. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence hold her. Later that afternoon, as the sun broke through the grey clouds, Eleanor asked Adam if he fancied a walk. They closed early. No announcement. Just a hand-lettered sign, "Gone to find a view." They walked in silence through the cobbled streets, across the footbridge, and toward the coastline. The air was damp but gentle, the kind of chill that reminded you to breathe. "I used to come here when I was younger," Eleanor said as they approached the old stone path to the lighthouse. "Before the children. Before everything. I used to believe the sea could carry away whatever hurt I couldn't hold." They sat on a bench facing the cliffs. Below, the waves rolled in steady murmurs. The lighthouse loomed quietly behind them, weather-beaten and watching. Adam leaned back. "Do you miss it? The sea?" "No. Before." Eleanor was quiet a long while. "Then, sometimes. But I think I was more lost then than I realized. Being needed kept me from noticing. And when I stopped being needed, I thought I was nothing." Adam glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "I think I'm starting to remember that I'm someone else, too," Eleanor said. "Someone who existed before the wife, before the mother." The wind tousled her graying hair, and she didn't smooth it back. For once, she let it dance. Adam took a small notebook from his coat and handed it to her. "I was going to wait, but this feels like the right moment." Eleanor opened it. Inside were entries written in two hands, her own, and his. Observations, titles, sentences begun but never finished. Bits of thoughts that had filled the quiet evenings in the shop. She turned a page and found a single line. "This isn't a chapter's end. It's a new genre." She looked up, and Adam just shrugged, smiling shyly. That night, back at the shop, Eleanor lit the lamp above the door and stared out into the street. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a character waiting for someone else to write her story. 2 days after their walk to the lighthouse, something strange happened in the bookshop. It was just after closing time, the windows fogged, rain tapping softly on the glass. Eleanor was rearranging a stack of poetry anthologies when a dull clatter echoed from the back room. She froze. Adam had already gone home. She followed the sound cautiously. The back room was small, mostly used for storage and overstock. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one peculiar thing. The painting on the back wall, an old oil of a coastal village, was tilted. She stepped closer and reached for the frame. As she adjusted it, her fingers caught on something lodged behind it. Curious, she tugged gently. Out slid a rusted, iron key. It was heavy. Cold. She turned it in her palm, brow furrowed. There were no locked cabinets in the shop, no old safes or forgotten drawers, at least none she'd found. But Eleanor had lived enough years to trust when a story began to nudge her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The key lay on her nightstand, catching the moonlight like a whisper. At dawn, she rose early, dressed, and left a note for Adam on the counter, gone to follow something old. She took the train north. By midday, she arrived in the small village of Lindale. It hadn't changed much since the last time she'd been there, over 2 decades ago. The harbour still creaked. The pub still leaned too far to the left. And the cottage on the hill still sat with its back to the sea, hidden behind thick pines and ivy. Her mother's house. It had passed to Eleanor after her death, but she'd locked it up and left it untouched. She hadn't had the heart, or the courage, to return. But now, key in hand, she climbed the gravel path. The front door was stiff, but it opened. The air inside was cool and dust-sweet, filled with echoes. Furniture covered in white cloths. Frames dulled by time. She stepped carefully, each footfall like a memory. Upstairs, in the old sewing room, she found what the key belonged to. An oak chest, carved with ivy and birds, tucked beneath the window seat. The lock clicked open with a soft sigh. Inside were things she hadn't thought about in years, letters from her mother, notebooks filled with pressed flowers and recipes, a child's drawing with a sun too big for the sky. But beneath it all, wrapped in tissue and ribbon, was a leather-bound book. It was a manuscript. Her mother's. She hadn't known it existed. Its title, handwritten in faded ink, The Woman Who Waited for the Moon. Eleanor sat on the floor beside the chest, book in her lap, the sea wind whistling softly through the open window. She opened the first page and began to read. As the words unfolded, a quiet realization settled over her. Her mother hadn't just been waiting for the moon. She'd been waiting for Eleanor to return, not just to the house, but to herself. And now, finally, she had. Eleanor returned to the bookshop 3 days later. She stepped off the train with the manuscript in her bag, her coat dusted with the salt of the northern air. The sky above Camberley was its usual slate grey, but to her, it looked like the first page of something new. Adam was already inside when she arrived. He looked up from the till, surprise softening into relief. "You're back." "I am," she said, simply. They didn't talk much that afternoon. Eleanor brewed a pot of tea and placed a bookmark in a customer's forgotten paperback. The routine grounded her, like walking barefoot after a storm. Later, when the shop had emptied and the final chime of the bell had faded, she reached into her bag and placed the manuscript gently on the table between them. "My mother wrote this." Adam blinked. "She was a writer." "She was many things," Eleanor replied. "But yes. And now, I think, she's ready to be heard." The manuscript was old but well kept. Each page was thick with careful prose, filled with the quiet weight of someone who had lived in silence too long. The story followed a woman who sat by the window each night, waiting not for rescue, but for memory, for the moon to rise so she could see herself clearly again. They spent the evening reading aloud, trading chapters as the kettle boiled again and again. At some point, Adam looked at Eleanor and said, "You should publish this." She nodded. Not immediately. Not for money. But for meaning. A few months passed. Spring rolled in on birdsong and lilac winds. The manuscript became a small, bound volume, printed locally. Eleanor shelved it under local authors with no fanfare. She didn't need any. Word of mouth did the rest. Readers returned, pressing the book to their chests, asking if the woman by the window had truly waited. Some cried. Some stayed after closing, wanting to talk about what it meant to lose yourself, and to find your way again. One afternoon, as Adam was straightening the poetry section, he found a small note tucked between 2 volumes. "Thank you for not giving up on stories. They are still saving people." There was no name. Eleanor placed the note in her desk drawer, next to a dried sprig of rosemary and a worn photograph of the shop from years ago. That night, she climbed the stairs to her flat above the bookshop and paused at the door. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows slightly. She could hear the distant hum of life, cars, laughter, someone humming a tune she almost recognized. She opened her journal and wrote one last line before sleep. Some books wait for the right reader. Some readers wait for the right story. And some stories wait for the right time to be remembered. Then she closed the book and turned out the light.